Today I will cover a game between Magnus and Wesley So. This is a game from Goldmoney Asian Rapid 2021 and this is a game number 1 of the quarterfinals day 2. And let's see the performance of these players. In this game Wesley So made only one blunder in the game and we have 3 inaccuracy, 0 mistake and 0 blunder by Magnus Carlsen. In this game Wesley had the white pieces and let's check out this game. So Wesley with the white pieces opened with e4, e5 by Magnus and knight to f3, knight to c6 and now bishop to c4. So this is the Italian game. The bishop to c5 by Wesley and now c3, knight to f6 and now d3. The bishop we have d6 now and now bishop to g5, just pinning the knight. We have immediate h6 by Magnus and now bishop to h4. Now we have a6. Probably Magnus is preparing b5. Now we have knight b to d2 and now bishop to a7. In this position, after this move, if you immediately play b5, then white can play bishop to d5 and you can see you can capture this bishop because this knight is pinned. So after you play something, bishop to b7, then d4 is possible, and after bishop to b6, d captures on e5, d captures on e5 and now queen to e2, queen to d6 and now bishop captures, queen captures and now castles by white, castles by black. And this position is, in this position white is slightly better in this position, so b5 is an option in this immediate b5. But in the game after this knight b to d2, Magnus played bishop to a7. Now we have a4 by Wesley. Now he is not allowing any b5 idea. We have queen to e7 and now castles by white. We have bishop to e6 by Magnus, just countering this light square bishop. Now we have b4 and now castles by black. Now we have rook to e1 and now bishop captures, knight captures and now queen to e6. Now we have b5, just attacking the knight, knight to e7 and now bishop captures on f6, queen captures and now rook to b1. In this position Wesley played a captures on b5, a captures on b5 by Magnus and now knight to g6. We have g3 now and now rook f to c8. We have king to g2 and now knight to f8. We have d4 now, queen to e6 and now queen to d3. Now we have knight to d7 and now even h4. Now we have bishop to b6 and now knight to e3. We have knight to f6 and now knight to c4. We have rook to a2. So Magnus will definitely play rook to a8 to double up on the a file. Now we have knight f to d2, rook c to a8 and now rook to e2. We have rook 8 to a4 and now rook b to e1, g6 now and now knight captures on b6, c captures and now knight to f3 and now king to a g7, just improving the position of the king. Now we have rook captures on a2, rook captures and now c4. Now we have rook to a4, now attacking this pawn twice. Now knight to d2. In this position Wesley defended by playing knight to d2, but if you wonder what if white pushes d5, if you push d5 then black can play queen to 8 and after rook to c1 then queen to c8 and after knight to d2 then queen to a8 is also possible. Now after rook to c3 then queen to a5, rook to c2 and now rook to a3, just attacking the queen. And after queen moves queen to e2 then you can play queen to a4. Now black is threatening to capture this rook, so you have to play rook to c1 and after queen to b4, rook to c2 again, rook to a1 and queen to f3. And in this position is more active for black, so that is why after this rook to a4 move Wesley played knight to d2 to defend this pawn. Now Magnus played rook to a2 and now rook to e2 by Wesley, queen to g4 and now f3, just attacking the queen. We have queen to c8, this is the strongest move, and now rook to f2, rook to f4, rook to a4 now and now queen to b3, rook to 8 and now queen to c3. We have rook to a5 now offering a queen trade. We have queen captures, b captures. Now we can see in this position black has a fast pawn. We have d captures on e5, d captures on e5, and now knight to b3. Now Magnus played b6 to give additional support to this pawn. Now we have rook to c2 and now rook to a3. We have knight to d2 and now knight to d7. We have c5 now. Knight captures, now knight to c4 attacking the rook. We have rook to b3, and this is the critical position of the game where you should play the correct move. In the game Wesley played knight captures on b6, but knight captures on b6 is a blunder in this position. When Wesley played knight captures on b6, he had only 58 seconds on the clock. In this position he played this move, but this move is actually a blunder, and this is the only blunder he made in this game, because here is the correct move is knight captures on a5. If you play knight captures on a5, then rook captures on b5, after knight to c4, knight to d3, and now rook to c3, knight to b2, and now after knight to e3, the game continues. And this position, in this position white is black, this position is more active for black. Black has a fast pawn, but this is questionable whether it will be black will win or it will be a draw. So after this move, rook to b3, Wesley played knight captures on b6. This is not the correct move, and Magnus immediately played rook captures on b5. Knight to c3. Now Magnus pushes the pawn to a4. Knight captures on e5, and now Magnus played knight captures on e4. The point is, if you capture this pawn, then rook can capture this knight. We have knight to d3 and now knight to d6. We have rook to c6, just attacking the knight. We have rook to d5 while defending, also attacking this knight. We have knight to b4 and now rook to d2 with check. King to h3 and now knight to f5. We have rook to a6 and now rook to f2, just attacking this pawn. So Wesley played g4, but now h5. We have king to f4 and now rook to d2. Now Wesley played g4, but now rook to d4 with check, king to e5, and now h captures on g4. F captures and now rook captures. Now in this position Wesley played knight to d5, but now we have rook captures, knight to f6, and now rook to h1. Now we have knight to e8 with check, king to f8, and now knight to f6. Now Wesley gives another Magnus gives another check. We have king to f4 and now king to g7. Now we have knight to e4, rook to a1, and now knight to c3. Now there is a double attack on this pawn. So Magnus pushes a4, a3. Now we have king to e4 and now knight to g3 with check. King to f3 and now knight to h5, rook to a7, just pinning this pawn. We have g5 now, and now rook to a6. In this position Magnus played f5, and you can see black is controlling all the important square in front of the king. Now we have rook to a7 with check, king to f6, rook to a6 with check, king to f7, and now king to e6, and now rook to a6 with check, just king to d7, and Wesley played rook to a5. The point is, if you push f4, then you will lose this pawn. So Magnus played g4 with check, king to f2, and now king to e6, just defending this pawn. Knight to b5 and now even a2. Knight to d4 with check, king to d7, rook to a7 with check, king to 8, and now knight captures on f5. We have rook to h1 and now knight to g3, knight captures on g3, rook captures. We have f5 now, and now rook to a4. We have g3 with check, now king to g2, rook to h with check, king to g1, and now rook to e2. Now we have rook to g4, but now Magnus played rook to e1, and you can see all the squares are covered. You have to play g2, and after g2, in this position Magnus just played knight to e3 with check, and you can see black will win this rook. So after this check, in this position actually Wesley So resigned the game, and this is totally lost position for white. Black will simply capture this rook, and after you capture this pawn, then white has a rook and black has a rook and black is winning here. So that was the game number 1 of the day 2 quarterfinals. I hope you enjoyed that game. So stay tuned for more updates, and thank you for watching.